For the first 24 hours, the assumptions made sense. A runner goes missing in Wyoming's mountains, an injury, a wrong turn, a twisted ankle, maybe a medical emergency. Those are the kinds of calls search and rescue teams respond to all the time, every year. After 48 hours, it was maybe still reasonable. The search was growing, more people, more resources, more ground covered, but still no Amy. But by 72 hours, the question should have started changing. And not because the search was failing, because it wasn't. This wasn't a handful of volunteers wandering through the woods. This was one of the largest and most professional search operations that Wyoming had ever seen. Search and rescue, the National Guard, helicopters, scent dogs, cadaver dogs, professional climbers, Knowles instructors, local outdoor experts, hundreds of people searching an area that, at least by Wyoming standards, was not especially remote. And they found nothing. No blood, no clothing, no injury site, no evidence of a fall, no evidence of a predator attack, no evidence that Amy Wroe Bechtel was anywhere investigators thought she should be. And yet, it would take nearly 5 days before the FBI arrived and the investigation began transitioning from a search for a missing runner to the possibility of a crime. Now, before we go any further, I want to be clear about something. I am not saying that investigators should have ignored Steve Bechtel. Quite the opposite. Looking at a spouse is exactly what investigators are supposed to do. In fact, if they hadn't investigated Steve, I would be criticizing them for that instead. The question is not why investigators looked at Steve. The question is why investigators became increasingly focused on Steve while the evidence remained increasingly uncertain. Because the deeper that I've gone into this case, the more convinced I've become that Amy Bechtel's disappearance isn't just a story about a missing woman. It's a story about investigative decisions. It's a story about evidence. It's a story about missed opportunities. And it's a story about what happens when an investigation may become committed to a theory before the evidence has earned that certainty. So tonight, we are not asking what happened to Amy Wroe Bechtel. We're asking what the hell happened in this investigation. By the end of episode 2, we had reached a point that I think most listeners would find unsettling. Amy Wroe Bechtel had vanished. Her car had been found at the Burnt Gulch turnoff. Witnesses had likely seen her running on the loop road, and then nothing. No confirmed sightings, no body, no explanation. Now, when most people think about Amy's case, they immediately jump to Steve, her husband, the suspect, the theory that would eventually dominate the public discussion of this case. But that is not where this story starts. At least, it shouldn't be. Before investigators could decide who was responsible, they first needed to answer a much simpler question. What the hell happened? And in my opinion, that's where this investigation begins to run into trouble. And not because investigators looked at Steve, and not because they considered foul play, not because they explored the possibility that Amy's disappearance wasn't an accident. Those were all very reasonable things to do. The problem is, as we move through those early days and weeks of this investigation, we're going to see a pattern start to emerge. Evidence that wasn't collected, evidence that wasn't preserved, witnesses who were never identified, opportunities that existed once and then disappeared forever. And here's the reality of criminal investigations. You don't get do-overs. A crime scene only exists once. A witness's memory is never clearer than it is immediately after the event. A footprint destroyed today can't be recreated tomorrow. A vehicle contaminated one day cannot be uncontaminated on day 10. Once evidence is gone, it's gone. It's gone forever. And when enough of those opportunities are lost, investigators often find themselves with fewer and fewer places left to look. I think that's exactly what happened here. And not because anyone set out to sabotage this investigation, and not because anyone wanted Amy's case to remain unsolved forever, but because a series of decisions, delays, and missed opportunities may have created a situation where the investigation became increasingly dependent on one theory while other possibilities received less and less attention. Now, some of you are probably going to disagree with my conclusions. That's okay. In fact, I hope you do. My goal is not to tell you what to think. My goal is to show you the evidence, walk you through the decisions that were made, and explain why I believe those decisions may still be affecting Amy's case nearly 3 decades later. Because if we're ever going to understand what happened to Amy Wroe Bechtel, we first have to understand what happened to the investigation. Welcome back, listeners, to Rocky Mountain Reckoning. This is a series where we return to the crimes rooted deep in the dirt and the snow of the American West, the ones that never left the hearts of the people who lived through them. We investigate the stories buried under snowfall, prairie dust, and decades of unanswered questions, the ones whispered through cattle fences, past broken barbed wire, and across wind-lashed highways. I'm your host, John. Now, before we get started, I should mention that Angela will not be joining us for this episode. Between work schedules, life, and the realities of producing a podcast, we just couldn't get our calendars to line up. Since this episode focuses heavily on investigative decisions, evidence, and my own analysis of the case, I decided to go ahead and move forward with this solo episode. Angela will be back in future episodes, but tonight, it's just you and me. Now, over the last 2 episodes, we've talked about Amy Wroe Bechtel's life, her plans for the future, and the events of July 24th, 1997. We've followed her through her final confirmed day, we've walked the roads that she likely traveled, and we've traced the timeline right up to the moment that she disappeared. Tonight, the focus shifts. This isn't an episode about Amy's route. It isn't an episode about the search. And it isn't an episode about suspects. Not yet. This is an episode about investigative decision-making, about what investigators knew, what they didn't know, what they did, what they failed to do, and whether some of those early decisions may have changed the trajectory of this case forever. Because by the end of the first week, investigators were beginning to move away from the idea of a lost runner and towards the possibility of a crime. The question is whether they followed the evidence there, or whether the evidence began following the theory. This is Rocky Mountain Reckoning, and this is the disappearance of Amy Wroe Bechtel, Part 3, the investigation. So let's start off with a question. When should investigators have stopped treating Amy's disappearance solely as a search and rescue operation and begun conducting a parallel criminal investigation? So if we look at the timeline in this case, Amy is reported missing on the evening of July 24th, 1997. And then that night, around 1 o'clock in the morning, her vehicle is located and the large-scale search begins almost immediately. The criminal focus develops approximately 5 days after that with FBI involvement. Now, looking at the search, we've talked about it. We're not going to dwell on it tonight, but it was a very large-scale search. Hundreds of searchers, search and rescue, the National Guard, helicopters, dogs, professional climbers, local outdoor experts, and they're searching in an area which I've tried to describe the best that I can, but it's mixed timber and open country. You know, I was talking to somebody about it the other day, and I described it in this way. Instead of thinking about a heavily forested area with pockets of breaks of like meadows and stuff like that, instead, this area is more like a relatively open area with some sagebrush plains and then pockets of timber that kind of break that up a little bit. So mostly open with some timber in the area, which means that There was long sight lines in many, if not most locations, especially along the roadway, and very searchable terrain compared to more dense mountain wilderness, especially by air. Then we also have the vehicle that was found there. The keys were left inside, sunglasses were left in the vehicle, the to-do list with the mileage notes was left in the vehicle, and the vehicle was left unlocked. And then we have the Gibson sighting of who I do believe was Amy about 5 o'clock running down the loop road back towards her car. The Gibsons also reported seeing the gray pickup with the shirtless man cutting firewood. And so when we look at the evidence that should have supported continuing to search, we have what we've been talking about. We had an experienced runner who was familiar with the area, no confirmed crime scene, no evidence of an abduction, and no direct evidence of any kind of foul play. But what I argue is the evidence that supports starting a parallel investigation earlier is we have Amy's vehicle that's located without Amy, her personal belongings that were left behind. There's no accident scene that was located. No injury evidence was located. No biological evidence of any kind was found. No signs of an animal attack or anything like that. And we have witnesses and vehicles that were present in the area, which really required identification. And I think it's important to realize that investigators were not in a situation where they needed to choose between either searching for Amy or investigate what happened to Amy, because both should have occurred simultaneously. The search could have easily continued while the vehicle was preserved, witnesses were identified, the occupants in that area were documented, a potential crime scene was protective, and any alternative explanations were explored. Which brings us to question number 2. What would have investigators have lost by beginning a parallel investigation on day 1? Now you might think, well, they were busy searching, but in response to that, I would have to say that search operations and criminal investigations are conducted simultaneously in missing persons cases all the time. And in this case in particular, we had a unique group of individuals that were more than capable of conducting this search without sheriff's investigators having any part in it whatsoever. Now, would I feel differently if Amy were inexperienced or unfamiliar with the area or lost deep in the wilderness? I would have to answer that a couple different ways. If Amy were just inexperienced, but all the other conditions that we've been talking about were the same, then no, I wouldn't feel any different. I still believe you start a parallel investigation immediately. If it was somebody that was unfamiliar with the area, but all other conditions remain the same, then no, I say you continue on with a parallel investigation and a search. Now, if we're talking about somebody that was last seen deep in the wilderness, then yeah, maybe you conduct this a little bit differently because the likelihood of criminal activity deep in the wilderness is significantly less than in a location frequented by a lot of people. So I would argue that within 24 hours of not finding any sign of an accident or somebody lost or finding Amy, investigators should have been conducting a parallel criminal investigation. I think some reasonable people would disagree with me and say, no, after 48 hours, it should have been 48 hours. And I would have a hard time arguing that assertion. However, waiting almost 5 days before meaningfully shifting the investigative posture is really difficult to justify, given the scale of this search, the terrain that they were in, the witness information that places her near her car at 5 o'clock, the vehicle circumstances, and the complete absence of any evidence indicating that Amy remained in that search area. And so, if investigators should have began the criminal investigation sooner, what opportunities were lost while the case continued to be treated primarily as a search and rescue operation? And I would say that this question is important to ask because evidence is easiest to collect immediately. Witness memories are freshest immediately. The crime scene only exists once. Lost opportunities cannot be recreated. Now, what we know is that none of the routes in or out of the area were closed. There was no vehicle checkpoints set up or established anywhere. Burnt Gulch was not treated as a crime scene for approximately a week. Todd and Amy Skinner were the ones that found Amy's vehicle. And in no way do I want this to come across as a critique to them. They did everything right. They went and did what should have been done by law enforcement. But then law enforcement allowed the Skinners to drive Amy's vehicle home. A footprint that was at least believed to be associated with Amy was destroyed. And so therefore, we'll never know if it had any relevance to the case or not. And volunteer searchers entered and moved throughout the area before any crime scene preservation occurred. The current cold case investigator on this case is a detective by the name of John Zerga. And a quote from him backing up exactly what I'm saying is, quote, "We didn't close off any routes out of there. We didn't close off any vehicles. We actually ruined it with the vehicle because we allowed the Skinners to drive it home." And he also goes on to say the investigation was not good for at least the first 3 days. There was a lot of stuff that was lost. That is from the investigator. That is not coming from me. And these are among the strongest documented admissions in this entire case. So the first fact is no routes were closed, no vehicle checkpoints were established. And that matters because every vehicle leaving that area represented either a potential witness, a potential suspect, or a potential source of information, even for a missing person. Once those vehicles left, many were never identified. And I'm not trying to argue that the offender definitely used Loop Road. What I'm saying is you cannot identify everyone who was there if you never identify anyone who was there. And then the second thing is witness identification. It is a fact that multiple witnesses eventually surfaced through publicity. They came in on their own, such as the Gibson, the supposed blue pickup witness. There's another witness that talked about a yellow Bronco. Witnesses came forward. The investigation seems to have relied heavily on self-identifying witnesses rather than any kind of a systematic canvas. And so what witnesses never came forward? The sad reality is we don't know and we'll never know. And that is the problem. And then the third opportunity is the vehicle. Like we said, Todd and Amy Skinner found the vehicle. They're civilians. So it was found by civilians. It was first accessed by civilians. It was then allowed to be driven home by civilians. It was never preserved as a crime scene. And going back to Detective John Zerga, quote, "We actually ruined it with the vehicle." The vehicle was the only physical object unquestionably connected to Amy at the moment of her disappearance. Remember, we have no body, no clothing, no crime scene. So the vehicle was the case. And they decided to let civilians drive it home. And then opportunity number 4 is the Burnt Gulch scene preservation. The area was not declared a crime scene for approximately a week. Footprints were destroyed. Search activity altered the scene. And again, I'm not criticizing searchers. They did what they were supposed to do, what they were trained to do. Who didn't do what they were trained to do? Investigators, law enforcement. The question isn't whether evidence existed. The question is whether investigators preserved the opportunity to determine if evidence existed. And then we have opportunity number 5, the Loop Road response. We know that deputies responded to 9 Lucky Lane after Steve called to report Amy missing sometime between 10:45 and 11 o'clock. So I am not saying that law enforcement failed to respond because we know that they responded. But the actual issue is no deputy was dispatched to the Loop Road that night. The Skinners are the ones that conducted the field search. The Skinners are the ones that located the vehicle. Now, I've talked about this in previous episodes, but to me, it's absolutely absurd that a deputy was not sent up there to look around and make sure at least that we didn't have a young lady that had gotten herself into trouble somehow up there, fallen and broken an ankle, slipped and hit her head, had some kind of a medical event, something. It's absurd to me. The first people to encounter the most important physical evidence in this case were civilians because law enforcement failed to act. And that fact alone is reason to pause and think, what the hell happened here? Now, none of these missed opportunities, none of these decisions individually doom this investigation. Many investigations contain mistakes. I would say most do. Many investigations recover from those mistakes. Again, I would say most do. The problem in Amy's case is that they're cumulative. Every missed opportunity reduced the amount of evidence that was available to the investigators. Every lost piece of evidence narrowed the investigation's options, and every narrowed option increased pressure to focus on the avenues that still remained open. Now, a potential argument to this line of thinking might be, well, we know things now that investigators didn't know back then. And that's true, but most of these criticisms that I'm making are not based on hindsight. They're not based on what happened later. They concern actions that were available in real time during this investigation and search. Things like preserving the vehicle. That's honestly a no-brainer. Controlling the routes in and out, again. Identifying witnesses that may have seen her and protecting the scene. Those are not things that we do only when a crime has occurred. These are customary things that we do all the time in missing persons cases. And more importantly, they're fundamentals when it comes to investigative practices. The issue is not that investigators made mistakes. We all make mistakes. The real issue is that several early opportunities were lost simultaneously. So by the time the investigation began shifting towards criminal activity, some of the most valuable evidence in this case and witness opportunities may already have been gone forever. Which brings us to the next question. If evidence was being lost and opportunities were disappearing, how did investigators decide where to focus their attention next? Why did investigators turn their attention to Steve Bechtel? Now, Steve was always going to be investigated, and he should have been investigated. The question is not whether investigators looked at Steve or should have looked at Steve. The question is whether the evidence justified the level of suspicion that developed. Now, let me start off by saying that the spouses of missing and murdered people are usually investigated first, and they should be. There's a good reason for that. Investigators absolutely had a duty to examine Steve's timeline, look at his behavior, analyze his statements. Failure to investigate him would itself be investigative malpractice. So by early August, the search had produced nothing. No body, no crime scene, no offender that was identified, and no physical evidence explaining Amy's disappearance. So investigators were under pressure to develop some kind of a direction to go. The evidence that was available to investigators at that time included the trip to Du Bois with Sam Leitner when Steve and Sam went up there on a climbing trip that day. So we have Sam Leitner's alibi. We have the 4:43 phone call that was made by Steve from 9 Lucky Lane. We have the evening activities from Steve in Lander, the calls to the family, the calls to the hospital, and then finally the missing persons report sometime between 10:45 and 11 o'clock. Now, the call was recorded, and Fremont County Sheriff's Office possessed the recording. And to quote Steve in that recording, Steve says, yeah, hey, I've got a missing person here, I think, and I wondered if you had a spare one around any place. That's a quote from the call. That is not the entire call. And that really becomes a concerning pattern in this case is we're giving enough information to be suspicious of Steve, but not enough information that we can analyze it in context. And lead investigator Dave King would describe that as, quote, lighthearted, almost joking. Now, what all did Steve actually say on that call? We don't know. We only have one sentence, which Jeff Billman published in Runner's World in 2016. And that is the quote that I just gave you. Yeah, hey, I got a missing person here. I wondered if you had a spare one around any place. That's the one sentence that the public has. The call was recorded. Now, Dave King's description of that call as being lighthearted and almost joking went out on the AP wire. It shaped how the public read Steve from that moment forward. And the tape itself, the one that King had heard, the one that he was characterizing, has never been released in full. People who had been with Steve in person that evening said that he was panicking and frantic. So you have a recording that the lead investigator is using publicly to support his theory of the case while keeping the recording itself completely out of the public view. And this is one of the cleanest examples of the investigative framing in this entire case. And so when you hear the snippet of this recording that's been released, or when you read what Steve said, you get one sentence. You don't get the full call. You don't get the dispatcher's responses. So we don't get the full context of what actually occurred. So I ask you, can a single sentence reliably establish guilt? I'd argue no. There's no way that it can. Now, to be fair, we have to analyze the evidence that supports the investigation of Steve. There are some reasonable grounds to look hard at him. He is, after all, the husband. He's the last known person that was expected to see Amy. His timeline requires verification. Their relationship requires examination. And the alibi requires examination. Those are all very reasonable. Investigating Steve was appropriate and necessary. But that brings us to the August 5th FBI interview. FBI agent Rick McCullough entered the interview carrying, quote, a thick folder of papers and files. Now, I've seen this reported as a binder, and I've seen it reported as a box. But all of the information that I can find, I think the most reliable information is that it was a thick folder of paper and files. Now, according to an article that was written in The Outside in 1998, Steve Bechtel recalled that FBI agent McCullough allegedly stated, quote, "We know you were responsible for your wife's disappearance. Here's the evidence to prove it." Now, this thick file of papers were presented approximately 12 days after Amy disappeared and 7 days after they really started investigating this as a crime. Now, let me be perfectly clear. That tactic of throwing a box or a binder or a folder or whatever on the table and saying, here's all the evidence that we have to prove that you're guilty is not an unusual tactic. And there's nothing wrong with using that tactic. It's used all the time by investigators and oftentimes successfully. What I find odd in this case is the timing of it. Now, like I said, investigators oftentimes confront suspects with evidence, with their certainty, with psychological pressure, and the goal is often to provoke some kind of a reaction. But the issue that I have here is whether investigators had enough evidence to justify that approach. Now, if we look at the evidence that was known at that time on August 5th, we have a missing wife with no body, no crime scene, no forensic evidence, no witnesses to a crime. What we don't know is what caused the disappearance, where Amy is, whether a crime had even occurred. So to me, this interview appears premature, to put it mildly, and not because Steve shouldn't have been questioned, but because it's way too early for this type of an interview. I'm a freaking podcaster, and I can recognize that fact. When I look at this, it was doomed to fail no matter what. And let me explain. If Steve is guilty, then he's going to look at that file of papers and he's going to do the math in his head. And he's going to say, now, wait a minute. At the most, you've been investigating this for 2 weeks. In reality, they'd been investigating it for 6 or 7 days. And you're telling me that you have enough evidence to prove my guilt after that amount of time? Now, a guilty person's going to go through that in his head and he's going to say, bullshit, I don't buy it. And an innocent person, I think an innocent person's going to do exactly what Steve did and what I think I would do. They're going to close down, they're going to call an attorney, and they're going to stop cooperating. Now, what might be unpopular to a lot of listeners is that I agree with that move by Steve. I would have done the exact same thing. If you sit me down and you accuse me of murdering my wife, I'm calling an attorney and I'm going to follow whatever he recommends. If he says, don't cooperate, I'm not going to cooperate. If he says, don't take a polygraph, I'm not going to take a polygraph. It could have gone a lot differently. Even if Steve is guilty, if they would have engaged him to help them clear him as a suspect, I think that Steve would have been very open to that and would have cooperated to the best of his ability. And I think I could say that because he initially agreed to the polygraph exam. It wasn't until after he spoke to counsel that he then refused to take a polygraph. But it shows to me that Steve wanted to help, but when you accuse somebody of murdering somebody, there's a degree of self-preservation that comes in no matter what. And it's easy to sit on the sidelines and say, well, if I had nothing to hide, then I would have taken the polygraph. That's an easy thing to say when you're not sitting there being accused of a very serious crime that could end you in prison for the rest of your life. By choosing to use this tactic as early as they did, I would argue that it might be one of the few investigative decisions that's going to create the same problem regardless of whether Steve is guilty or he's innocent. So like I said, investigators were right to focus on Steve. They were right to scrutinize Steve. They were right to dig into his alibis. They were right to look at him from every angle they could possibly look at him from. But by August 5th, investigators appear to have been communicating a level of certainty that the available evidence just had not yet earned. And I think it was obvious to Steve that they didn't have the evidence to back up the accusation. And once that confrontation occurred, investigators may have lost their best opportunity to obtain Steve's continued voluntary cooperation. And if Steve was guilty, they may have lost their one opportunity to find that out. Which brings us to the next question. If investigators were becoming increasingly convinced of Steve's involvement in Amy's disappearance, what evidence exactly was convincing them of that? So what was the basis for the August 6th search warrant? And did the results justify the confidence that investigators were placing in Steve Bechtel being guilty? Search warrants are among the most powerful tools that investigators have at their disposal. A warrant allows government intrusion into private homes, vehicles, records, and personal property. Now, the U.S. Constitution requires probable cause be shown because of how much power is inherent in the issuing of a search warrant. This warrant would produce journals that would shape the public discussion of this case for decades. Understanding the foundation of this warrant is essential to understanding everything that followed it. So on August the 5th, FBI agent McCullough conducts that confrontational interview with Steve. Steve then retains counsel, and investigators indicate a strong belief in his involvement in Amy's disappearance. And so on August 6th, the search warrant is executed at their home at 9 Lucky Lane. The house is searched. Steve's truck is searched. His journals are seized. Amy's journals are seized. A computer disk is seized. So what was the probable cause for that warrant? According to that same 1998 Outside Magazine report, which is essentially all we have to go on, the affidavit cited a single witness, an unnamed witness who said that they saw a pickup truck similar to Steve's racing through a loop road campground around 5 p.m. on the day of the disappearance, with a distraught blonde woman in the passenger seat. That's what the warrant was built on. One witness, one sighting, anonymous in print, possibly anonymous in the affidavit itself. And here's the part that really matters. The sighting was reported just before 5 p.m. And we know from phone records that Steve was on the phone with Ed Sherline at his house at 9 Lucky Lane in Lander at 4:43. The Loop Road campground is roughly a 45-minute drive from 9 Lucky Lane. The witness's timing and Steve's documented location cannot possibly both be true at the same time. A magistrate signed the warrant anyway. Now, we don't know if the affidavit acknowledged the phone record conflict or if it admitted it, because the affidavit for the search warrant has never been released. That document, sitting in a Fremont County court file 29 years later, is the single highest value piece of paper in this entire case. So knowing all of that, how much confidence should we place in a witness that we know almost nothing about? We know the witness's claim that a truck was seen near the Loop Road campground shortly before 5 p.m. We also know that Steve was on the phone with Ed Sherline at his house at 4:43. So we know it could not have possibly been Steve. Both of those things cannot be true at the same time. So either the witness was mistaken, their time estimate was inaccurate, the vehicle was not Steve's, investigators believed that the discrepancy was somehow explainable, or something else. Now, the public has spent nearly 30 years hearing about this witness, but we still don't know who this witness is, whether anything was actually ever corroborated, whether they were re-interviewed, whether they recanted, whether investigators today still consider this a credible witness. What we do know is the house was thoroughly searched. Cadaver dogs were used, no response. Luminol was used, negative response. His truck was thoroughly searched. No forensic evidence connecting Steve to any kind of a crime. There was no physical evidence found. No blood, no body, no remains, no weapon, no transfer evidence, no forensic evidence indicating that Amy was harmed in that residence at all. Before we keep going, I want to take a second to talk about something that matters beyond the episode itself. At Dark Dialogue, we've built something called the Adopt a Victim program. The goal is simple: to keep attention on the victims themselves, not just the case, and find answers for those stories without them. Because once the headlines fade, most people are forgotten. This is one way to make sure that that doesn't happen. If that's something that you want to be a part of, you can find it on the website along with the rest of the Dark Dialogue network. All right, so let's get back into this. So what was found? Now, what has been suggested, but that I was not able to confirm was seized, was a poem, which is widely cited on Wikipedia and other secondary sources, which describes an undated poem that revolved around murdering a person and hiding the remains. Now, whether this was like a loose page, whether it was in a journal or on a computer disk, none of that's clear from any of the public record. And really, most reporting groups this poem under the overall journal's umbrella. Now, I think what is worth mentioning here is For 30 years now, the public framing of Steve's journals has all been compressed into a single object. But this was not just a single notebook. Outside says, quote, a pile of journals that both Amy and Steve had kept over the past few years. That is plural, multiple journal volumes. Both Amy's and Steve's, not exclusively Steve's, spanning multiple years. Not just the months before Amy's disappearance, not just that year, and a pile, physically bulk, a pile of journals. So when Detective King, Reiser, or Zerga talks about Steve's journals, or when any secondary reporting refers to the journal, they're almost all certainly talking about selected passages from one or more volumes within a larger seizure, which included both Amy and Steve's writing. And really, all of the weight has been put entirely on a subset of Steve's writing. Whether Amy's journals contained anything investigatively significant or not, or anything that would complicate the husband suspect narrative, has never been made public or addressed by any investigator. And I think that asymmetry in itself is worth talking about. The Fremont County Sheriff's Office has had Amy's own journals in custody since August 6th of 1997. The public has never heard a single line from any of them. Every public quote from the journals has been from Steve's. The Wroe family was shown at least selected excerpts from those journals, and by all accounts, those excerpts were Steve's. Why Amy's journals have never been characterized publicly has never been answered. Now, the journals have been in the possession of the Fremont County Sheriff's Office from that day in August of 1997 until now. Now, a lot has been said about those journals over the years, most of which came from investigator Dave King, which I find incredibly strange and unprofessional, and we'll be getting into that a bit later. But what has been characterized publicly is the following: the dark poetry concerning power, death, and killing, which was reported in Cowboy State Daily in 2023, which is almost certainly a characterization that is downstream of Dave King's earlier public characterizations. We have an undated poem that revolved around murdering a person and then hiding the remains. That's reported in Wikipedia and secondary sources. I wasn't able to confirm it beyond that. Steve also wrote about an apparent need for control in his journal. Then we have Steve's own characterization saying that the dark material was written as song lyrics when he was in a punk band in high school, long before he ever even met Amy. And then we have investigator Dave King's characterization of the material, quote, the Bechtels' marriage was not going as smoothly as once thought after reading journal entries made by the couple and information on a computer disk. And I think what's important about that is when he says entries made by the couple. So even King is characterizing both Amy and Steve's writing as the basis for the marital strain claim. Circling back around to the original question, what did they actually take during the search of the property? The AP reporting from January of 98 adds one item to what was reported by the Outside magazine, and that is a computer disk. Dave King confirmed publicly that investigators had read information on that computer disk and had used that information along with the journal entries made by the couple to characterize their marriage as troubled. The house itself was searched. Investigators found no incriminating physical evidence whatsoever. What they left with was paper, journals from both Amy and Steve, and a computer disk. That's it. And here is the part that I keep coming back to. Fremont County Sheriff's Office has had those journals in their custody for 29 years. The public has never heard a single line from any of Amy's own writing. Every publicly characterized passage has been from Steve, and they've been damn few. We don't know what was in Amy's journals. We've never been told. We don't really even know what was in Steve's journals. We don't know how anything falls within the context of that greater collection of writing, which really brings me to the question that troubles me the very most. If the warrant was obtained because investigators believe that Steve was responsible for his wife's death, then why didn't the results from that warrant execution cause any kind of a reassessment? Because the strongest thing the search produced was not evidence of murder. It was material that requires significant interpretation, and interpretation is very different from any kind of forensic evidence. So let's assume that Steve is guilty. What would we expect investigators to find when they execute a search warrant on somebody that is guilty for murder? We would expect maybe blood, evidence of a cleanup, transfer evidence, biological evidence, maybe not. To be perfectly honest, the absence of evidence does not prove innocence, but it also does nothing to strengthen guilt. That August 6th warrant may have been legally justified. It's never been presented to an appellate court. We don't know. Reasonable people can disagree about the legality of the warrant itself, but what is much harder to dispute is this. The search failed to produce forensic evidence that linked Steve Bechtel to any crime. Instead, investigators left with journals and a computer disk that requires all kinds of interpretation. And from this point forward, the investigation appears increasingly focused on interpreting Steve rather than discovering what happened to Amy. Which brings us to our next question. When did the investigation stop following the evidence and start following a theory? And this really is my central question in this entire case. Investigations are supposed to narrow because of evidence. They start very broad, and evidence narrows them down to hopefully a guilty suspect. When theories begin driving the evidence collection instead of evidence driving theories, then mistakes become increasingly difficult to correct. Once an investigation commits publicly that Steve is the murderer, then changing course becomes much harder to do. So by late summer of 1997, investigators had nothing. No body, no forensics, no nothing. Nothing linking Steve to a crime. And yet, public focus on Steve continued to increase. Now, we've talked about those journals and what was taken during the execution of the search warrant, but after the fact, investigators did something strange. They went out publicly and characterized portions of Steve's writings. But it's also a fact that the public has never been allowed to review the journals in their entirety. So for nearly 30 years, the public discussion has focused almost entirely on a few selected descriptions of Steve's writings, and nothing has ever been publicly discussed regarding Amy's journals. And so, can we independently evaluate evidence that we have never seen? We're not evaluating the journals. We're evaluating investigator characterizations of the journals, and those are not the same things. And then we have something very odd that happened in this case. Amy's family was brought in and they were shown previously undisclosed search information, selected journal material, and this happened a few weeks after they were seized during the execution of the search warrant. Now, why did they do this? I can't answer it, and I've really tried. I've spent, I can't tell you how much time trying to find something similar, and I haven't been able to. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means it's so freaking odd that I couldn't find it. Now, why? Why is it so strange that they would bring the family in and show them evidence? And there's a few reasons why. The first is the integrity of the evidence. Any future prosecution requires that witnesses, including the family members, who may testify about their marriage, about Steve's behavior, about the authenticity of the journals, whatever, the prosecution requires that those witnesses not have their independent recollections contaminated by exposure to investigative material. A family member who was shown selected journal passages or the journals in their entirety and characterized them as troubling cannot then later testify cleanly about what they independently believed about the marriage. Their testimony has now been pre-shaped by the investigators. The next reason is that the Wroes were potential witnesses. Almost certainly were going to be witnesses in any homicide trial where Steve was the defendant. Amy's family was going to be called, and their testimony about the marriage, about Steve's behavior in the days or the weeks after Amy's disappearance, about Amy's state of mind before her disappearance, all of that is witness testimony. And exposing them to the investigative material before the case has even been charged contaminates them as witnesses. Prosecutors typically push very hard against doing something like this. Defense attorneys definitely are going to take note of it, and judges will sometimes exclude testimony that's been tainted by something like this. And then you have civil liability, showing victim family members the contents of items seized under a warrant, items belonging to a third party who has not yet been charged with a crime, has some real potential for civil exposure for the agency if that third party is never charged with a crime, such as what happened in this case. If Steve had ever sued for defamation or for unconstitutional conduct, the family briefing would be discoverable, and it would look like agency-sanctioned damage to his reputation through selective disclosure of his private writings. And fourth, the journals belonged in part to Amy. All reporting is explicit that the seizure included a pile of journals that were both Amy's and Steve that they had kept over the past few years. Amy's own writing, her private record, her thoughts about her marriage and her plans and her observations was in that pile. Showing the Wroes, Amy's own journals raises a different category of question entirely. Was the family briefing limited only to Steve's writing, or did the family read their daughters' and their sisters' private journals? We just don't know. We've never been told. But how it would affect a prosecution in this case is a question definitely worth asking. And really, another thing that makes this so unusual is the direction of information flow. Now, family briefings in homicide cases typically go one of three ways. You either have a status update, something like, we're working on the case, we're following leads, we can't share the details. That's very normal, very routine. Or there could be theory disclosure to enlist the family's cooperation. Something like, we think that it might be the boyfriend and we need your help getting close to him. That's not nearly as common, and it's kind of an ethically gray area, but it does happen. Or you have witness preparation that's done by the prosecutors after the case has been charged. And when it's headed for trial, prosecutors might brief the family witnesses on what to expect. And sometimes that might include evidence that they will be asked about, and it could be forewarning them of evidence that they may be exposed to that could be emotionally troubling for them. But this is bounded by Brady and trial procedure. But none of that is what happened here. What happened here is some kind of a weird fourth category. The agency, with no charge filed and no prosecutor running point on it, showed the victim's family at least selected contents of items that were seized from a third party. Items that were not just the third party's, but also the victim's own, in order to shape the family's view of that third party. And then the family went on national television with the lead investigator within months of that. That is so unusual that I cannot find any parallel anywhere. And I tried. And I want to be careful not to overclaim that I know everything about everything. I don't. I'm sure there's cases where something like this has happened before. And there are cases where families have been kept very close to investigators and where that line between investigator and family has been blurred. Cheryl Smith in the Sherry Papini case, the various disappeared style cases where parents have effectively been investigative partners with the investigators. But in those cases, the evidence that is shown is typically physical findings, search areas, recovered items, photographs, not the private writings of an uncharged person. That Bechtel family briefing is really closer in shape to something that prosecutors do during a grand jury preparation that's conducted by agency investigators before a grand jury has ever even convened. The Casper grand jury in this case did not convene until November of 1997. The Wroes were showing the material a few weeks after the August 6th seizure. So before any grand jury proceeding, before any charging decision, before any prosecutor was even driving the case. And the other big part of this that really concerns me is the Wroes were not showing the journals neutrally. They were showing Steve's journal entries, meaning selected entries from Steve's writing, characterized by investigator Dave King as being troubling. Now, there's no source describing them being Amy's own journals from that same seizure, or being told that the seizure included Amy's writings too, or being given any context that Steve had described the dark material as teenage punk band lyrics before he even met Amy. What the family was given, on the public record at least, is a curated selection of Steve's most concerning passages, presented by investigators who were already focused on Steve, and weeks before any charging decision and months before a grand jury. Of course, the family's view of Steve is going to change at that point. The intervention was structured to produce exactly that result. Joanne Wroe's August 1998 quote saying, "It's a strain being around Steve knowing he's still a suspect," was reported in that Outside article. And that sentence really captures the cascade. The family is now treating Steve as still a suspect, which is the framing that investigators had given him. The family's belief is now downstream of the investigators' belief. And the family's public statements are now reinforcing the investigators' theory of the case. And this is a feedback loop that is not supposed to happen in a clean investigation. Investigators are supposed to gather evidence. Family members provide independent testimony. The case is built from the convergence of both of those things. Here, the agency is seeding the family's view of the suspect with selected items from a sealed seizure, and the family then publicly amplifies that view, including on national television alongside the lead investigator in the case, in a way that put pressure back on the suspect to take a polygraph. Now, I want to be clear here. I am not criticizing the Wroes. They performed, I think, exactly like any family would. But I am criticizing how this was conducted by the investigators. It is so outside the norm that I'm almost at a loss for words on what to say. And then the lead investigator on the case went out publicly and discussed Steve's journals, Steve's tone during the 911 call, Steve's cooperation or lack of cooperation, Steve's refusal to take a polygraph. And it's also a fact that investigators did not publicly discuss that the luminol results during the same search were negative. The cadaver dogs had a negative response. The absolute absence of any forensic evidence and the total weakness of the entire theory behind how they secured that search warrant. So, what message does the public receive when only one side of the ledger is being discussed or offered? Now, the reality here is we're dealing with human nature. I'm not talking about somebody being evil. We have to consider the circumstances. We have a high-profile case with national attention. The FBI is involved. There's a lot of community pressure. We have a grieving family, and we have a young investigator who was just recently promoted from jailer to lead investigator, and he's trying to establish himself and prove his ability to do this job. And in those situations, it is difficult for anybody to admit, I got this wrong, especially after they've gone out and made all kinds of public statements about how certain they are about their theory. They've made multiple media appearances, including the Geraldo Rivera show. They've briefed the family on this entire theory. They've spent years of commitment to the theory. So what would investigators need to find in order to reconsider Steve as the suspect? Because none of the results from the search warrant provided any reason to consider Steve guilty, in my opinion. So what actually happened in this case after the execution of the search warrant? Did any of the warrant results provide a reason to reconsider Steve? Or did the theory continue despite the lack of any supporting evidence? And I would argue that the latter is the truth. Investigators definitely continued focusing on Steve. Their public communications increasingly focused on Steve. No indictment was ever returned. No forensic evidence ever connected Steve to a crime. The investigation appears to have become increasingly committed to a Steve-centered explanation, despite failing to develop evidence that was capable of proving that explanation. And this case was never made in a courtroom. It was made in the public. And that distinction is really important because courtroom evidence is tested. Public narratives often aren't. So at some point, the central question appears to have changed. Instead of what happened to Amy Wroe Bechtel, the investigation increasingly appears to have asked, how do we prove that Steve Bechtel did this? And once that shift occurs, every piece of evidence risks being interpreted through that same lens. And then what happens? Alternative explanations stop being competitors and they start becoming obstacles. And so if investigators became committed to a Steve-centered theory, what evidence or leads or suspects existed outside of that framework? Because in the next episode, we're going to examine the roads that weren't taken, the tips that weren't pursued, the suspects that weren't explored, and the possibility that while investigators were looking in one direction, the truth may have been somewhere else entirely. Now, before we close tonight, I want to take a moment and step away from the investigators, the search warrants, the theories, the suspects, and everything else that so often dominates conversations about this case. Because at the center of all of this is Amy Wroe Bechtel, a daughter, a sister, a wife, a friend, a runner who loved Wyoming's mountains and open spaces, a woman whose absence is still felt nearly 3 decades later. Whatever happened on July 24th, 1997, Amy deserved a thorough investigation. Her family deserved answers, and the people who loved her deserved the chance to know the truth. Instead, they were left with questions that still remain today. As we continue this series, we will keep asking those questions. We'll keep examining the evidence, and we will keep searching for the truth. But tonight, before we leave, we remember Amy. This is Down the Road from the J.J. Hawk Band. And this is Amy Wroe Bechtel. Amy Wroe Bechtel was born on January the 4th, 1972, and grew up surrounded by the mountains, the rivers, and the wide open spaces of Wyoming. Those who knew her describe a woman who embraced life fully. She was intelligent, driven, adventurous, and fiercely independent. She excelled academically, earning degrees in physical education and athletic training. But she was never content to remain indoors. The outdoors was where Amy felt most at home. She ran trails, She climbed mountains, she skied, she explored, she challenged herself physically and mentally, always looking for the next adventure and the next horizon. Friends remember her smile, her energy, her kindness, her ability to make people feel welcome, her willingness to encourage others and help them believe that they could accomplish more than they thought possible. Amy wasn't simply someone who enjoyed the outdoors. She lived it. The mountains were not a destination. They were part of who she was. On July 24, 1997, Amy set out on what should have been an ordinary summer afternoon in a place that she knew well. She never came home. In the years that followed, countless volunteers have searched for her. Investigators pursued leads. Friends refused to give up hope. And her family continued searching for answers. Yet, despite all of that effort, Amy remains missing. For nearly 30 years, discussions about this case have often focused on suspects, investigators, theories, and mistakes. And those conversations matter, but they should never overshadow the person at the heart of this story. Amy is not a case file. She's not an evidence exhibit. She's not a theory. She is a human being whose life mattered. A daughter whose parents deserved answers. A sister whose absence left an empty chair at family gatherings. A wife whose future was stolen. A friend who never got the chance to grow old alongside the people who loved her. Somewhere beyond the headlines, beyond the arguments, and beyond the unanswered questions, there is still a woman who has never been brought home. And until that day comes, Amy's story remains unfinished. Amy Wroe Bechtel disappeared near Lander, Wyoming on July 24, 1997. She was 24 years old. She remains missing, and she remains remembered. Amy, thank you for trusting us with your story. You are missed, you are loved, and you will not be forgotten.